sometimes people ask me, okay, so how many genders are there really? And I'll say, oh, at least 7.8 billion, one for everyone on the planet. And that's at any given split second in time. And I think it's just framed my ability to perhaps be more in the present moment, and that, the more we break down the dreaded binaries of body and gender, and of course we look at nature and see that there's not just, these two distinct boxes, that it means that things are possible. And then it's really, then if those foundations are in place, it's over to the imagination, and it doesn't matter the body's gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, romantic label, whatever, of the people involved.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. Come with us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I identify as a cisgender woman, and my pronouns are she and her. In this episode, I have a conversation with Sally Goldner, an educator, speaker, leadership consultant and life coach. Sally's pronouns are she and her, and she identifies as a bi/pan, introvert and highly sensitive person, or HSP, trans woman. Find out what that means to Sally in this episode. We also talk about how our unique personality labels interact with each other, unlearning and unblocking ourselves, balancing the masculine and feminine in leadership by becoming better at receiving and listening, and breaking the binary by queering Tantra. It was recorded on the 19th of April 2021. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Hi, I'm Sally, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, Sally. And how do you identify?
I identify as a bi/pan, neurodivergent, including introvert and highly sensitive person, also cyclothymic in terms of mental health, trans woman, and Jewish as well, just to name a few. And if you want some humour added in, also as a fan of world wrestling, entertainment and music of the binary kinds, country and Western.
Awesome. I love it. And how's your gender journey developed?
Well, so I suppose a potted history or something like that.
Yeah.
So I always say there's two critical moments, and I live in what is now called Melbourne, Australia, although it was originally under the Aboriginal people who lived here called the Area Naam. And I should acknowledge, as we do in Australia, that I'm on Wurundjeri land, acknowledging and in particular my local people are called the Bolin, B-O-L-N. And the thing is that I often say in this city now called Melbourne, which is the self-proclaimed, but with reason, coffee capital of the Southern Hemisphere, my soul, including my gender, yawned, stretched, awoke and asked for coffee at about age 29 and a half physical years. And so how does that work out? Let's just wander our way back to 16 October 1965, the day I was physically born, and to use my exact language, was assigned male, because of course all we can do is hold up a child once that's separated from the parent and say, oh, that body is what society calls male. We assign a sex, and then of course we assume a gender identity being boy, and we assume that the predominant gender expression will be masculine. And I suppose that there were two critical points, and one was, I remember my first day at school, aged 4 years and 3 months in February 1970. And I remember very much being at the door of the first classroom, looking in and almost wanting to run 20 metres backwards to where my mum was behind me. And that's because, as is similar between Australia and England, there are still some private schools as opposed to government-funded schools that, whether religious or not, are, we'll say, single sex. So I spent all 13 years at what was called an all-boys school. Now, of course, in the end I proved them wrong, but that wasn't until much later. So there was already a feeling of, hang on, something's not right here. Now, of course, as a 4 and a bit-year-old, I couldn't explain that in adult language like I am now at 55 and a half. However, something wasn't right. And of course, as time wore on, I realised that I was the proverbial, sort of sheep in a flock of wolves or something. And particularly this school was having a huge emphasis on sport. The principal at the time had decided that if we won all the championships, it would be great for morale internally, be a great marketing point for the school externally. Teensy-weensy problems at my end. I wear glasses, not because I'm long-sighted or short-sighted. It's because I have what's called a turn in one eye. In plain language, my eyes aren't in stereo. So given that we're talking from Australia to England, we both hopefully have some understanding of cricket. And so let's imagine batting at cricket where you've got to watch the ball out of the bowler's hand, see if it's going to be an in-swing or an out-swing, or whether it's going to be pitched up or pitched short. And also, I'm not a reflex person, and then make a reflex decision as to what stroke to make. Well, I'm not even seeing the damn ball in the first place, so it's pot luck if I hit it almost. I was better at bowling because that was a bit more strategic and, do a couple of outswingers than an in-swinger, but that was where it ended. Football, well, Australia, the predominant code where I live and most of the country now is Australian rules football with the oval-shaped ball or elliptical-shaped ball, whatever we want to call it. And so it's not soccer where it's nice and round. And so dropping the ball onto the boot to do the various styles of kicking, same thing. I'm going to miss it. It's not going to land properly. So I got a lot of verbal ridicule for not being good at sport. And finally, the school was very competitive academically, both from the teaching end and also from students. If you weren't in the top 5%, the student, there was this huge pecking order thing. It was, use today's language, then to use the term that was used, it was toxic masculinity. And yet, of course, I didn't know anything about gender at that time. Remember, we're going through the 1970s, early 80s, and it sounds so quaint now, given that we're having this conversation over the internet, but there was no internet back then. The other thing that happened is where, the aspect of having a Jewish background comes in. And this school was a Anglican Christian or assumed all boys school. But I also spent, every Sunday morning from about age 5 through to 13 going to Jewish Sunday school to learn a little bit of Hebrew. And then up until 13, of course, comes that huge important moment in an assigned male Jewish person's life, or so it seems important, of a bar mitzvah. Some stand up in synagogue, read out of the Torah, the coming of age of a Jewish boy into a man. Well, I couldn't come of age of any boy into any man. Wasn't going to happen. So it was always this feeling of, in inverted commas, something's wrong with me. But of course there wasn't. I just was missing a piece of jigsaw puzzle to fit it all together. So fast forward very quickly, I finished school. I went to university and studied a commerce degree. I majored in accounting. I tried to work as an accountant in the corporate sector, and that was more toxic masculinity. I burnt out very quickly, and I travelled for 3 months in the middle of 1994, and that got rid of the burnout. But I think also while being relaxed overseas, travelling, allegedly, possibly in someone's opinion, drinking 1 or 2 beers too many somewhere, but that's another story. I came back and was more relaxed, but I think what had happened was what I'd been unknowingly, in fairness to myself, pushing down, because I'd always had some vague idea, very vague, in inverted commas, of looking like a woman, whatever that meant. And, remember, again, we're still now coming through the 80s and 90s. But I didn't realise I'd been pushing it down, and had begun to come up maybe because I was more relaxed. I'd taken away those day-to-day work pressures. And finally, I remember New Year's Day 1995, I told someone else about I'll use the phrase how I saw myself, but it could have been how I felt or how I thought about myself. No real big deal there. Now, by 1995, we did have internet. Do our dear listeners remember dial-up internet?
Oh my God! Oh, that was chronic. It made me lose the will to live using dial-up internet. Seriously.
Well, that was the thing, so you'd dial up and then maybe a page would turn, you'd go off and make your cup of tea or coffee,
That's
and
right.
20 minutes later come back and maybe a page would have loaded or 5 emails with no
Right.
attachments would have downloaded. So there still wasn't much information on it, even though there was internet. So that didn't help. I tried libraries. I went back to the University of Melbourne where I studied, trying to find things, and just didn't find anything that made sense. And unfortunately, and I will say content warning here, my GP had referred me to a psychiatrist who was not helpful, to put it diplomatically. But if I wanted to be more direct, there was one session where she kept saying, so you first remember this. At that point, I'd only remembered when I was 6 years old, things that were happening. She kept trying to say, well, what was going on in your life then? She was trying to link it to something, which I didn't find out, of course, until much later, was an aspect of conversion practices. This whole, well, we'll find it and fix it, and then you'll all be right again. Oh, please, But, I've got to remember that I was obviously very unknowing. And if it wasn't for one particular supportive friend who came out to me, and I was only one of 3 people on the planet who knew this person was, their sexual orientation was bisexual, and no, it's not trans, but it's ballpark next door. And I think that sort of sense of disclosure and there are people out there who don't fit societal expectations in all these things was such a lifesaver. And eventually we tracked down, we'd heard vaguely of what in Melbourne, Australia is called the Monash Gender Clinic. It's the main publicly funded clinic for adults in Australia, or particularly in this area of Australia. And we rang an organisation with a similar name called Monash Health. We got put through to a duty psychiatrist, and she said, look, I don't know about this, but a friend of mine from university studied her master's in sexuality and gender. Here's her name, here's her number. And sure enough, I made an appointment, and I will remember this, 27 April 1995, so we come 26 years ago next week as we have our conversation. I went and saw this person, and she was really, really good. She did something which seemed so obvious. She listened. She didn't try to start coming in with her own ideas about what should happen. She didn't make me fill out a family tree diagram or 53 pages of paperwork or ask about substance abuse, which, yes, sometimes you might need to do. She just listened for 20 minutes, and then I sort of went, oh. She said, thanks for sharing that. Has anyone ever explained this to you? This way, she said, and these were her exact words, some men are more masculine than feminine, more feminine than masculine. Some need to be female, and that's called transgender. Now, that's not the textbook definition we need for everyone, but it was still the light bulb coming on. It was exactly what I needed. And everything began to fall into place. Oh, that's why I didn't fit in an all-boys school. That's why bar mitzvah didn't mean anything. And why I didn't fit in very top, very limited corporate accounting environments, all those sorts of things. And I think the proof of it was that having that piece of jigsaw that just brought everything together, I remember 2 mornings after that waking up and just feeling so calm and relaxed because I finally had the key to everything. So from there, I joined a local group, mainly for trans women, but of course anyone can join. And there are variations of this group around the world. It's called Seahorse Club of Victoria, and I know there's a Seahorse group in Britain. And that was a good place to start. And for 2.5 years, I used the label cross-dresser. I occasionally went out as female. And, of course, there's international variations on all of these labels as well. We went with cross-dresser in the end for that sort of people who occasionally present as another gender identity and or expression. And that was, I think, a good stage in my life. I think if not that I really wanted to, but if theoretically I'd tried to jump to living as female 100%, I think that would have been too heavy because something happened to me at the time back in that April 1995. I thought, gee, I'm entering a bit of a different life to the sort of standard middle-class suburban accountant. And I thought maybe I should keep going with personal development and keep growing myself. And I think that, it was just a total intuition, but I think it was a good intuition at the time. So, the thing that happened in around mid-1997 was I began to be clearer about sexual and romantic orientation, I'd always thought of myself, sure, as attracted to women, but realised I could be attracted to men. And the only word I had at the time was bisexual, thanks to my supportive friend. And at that point, and then just to finish this bit off later on, wasn't until the early 2000s I heard the term pansexual, and I heard pan first explained as knowing no boundaries of, later just simply all. And yeah, to me personally, subjectively, the words are similar. Just gender's not the first thing I'm looking for in a partner. There could be other things as well.
Yeah, I resonate with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I go with pansexual as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that sort of the sexual orientation, romantic orientation stuff's been clear ever since, but it wasn't until the early 2000s that I heard more about genders beyond binary male and female, and that's where pan even made more sense to me, because I say that I'm attracted more to women and non-binary genders than men. I'll stick with non-binary to keep it concise from now on, acknowledging everyone's label. But it wasn't in early 1998, and of course this was the Australian Southern Hemisphere summer, and most years in Melbourne we have our Pride March at the end of January, and it coincides with a festival called Midsummer, which is our Queer Arts and Culture Festival. And there were lots of events on, and I began to go into more of them as Sally and being myself. And it was at that point that I realised, yeah, I need to live as my true authentic self as a woman all the time. And, just the male facade, if there ever was one, it just sort of vanished, it disintegrated. And so I've lived it as myself ever since. And, the gender side of me has been, settled now at the time of our conversation for, 23 years. Gosh. Time goes fast. So just over that amount of time. And I've gone on from there and sort of, that's really the gender journey. But of course, there's been lots of other roads to travel since. Sure, once I finished when I say finished, I settled where my sense of gender was in the late 1990s. Of course, that had been the immediate pressing issue, and I'd settled my sexuality. But one of my favourite book title ever, and it's a good book as well, is a book by an Australian gay man, Anthony Venn Brown. It's called A Life of Unlearning. And I think that that's a really important thing, because we can't learn more perhaps sometimes until we unlearn and we unblock ourselves. And as well as having negative attitudes towards me, resulting in negative experiences relating to gender more than sexual and romantic attraction, other things about me had sort of been been demeaned a lot as well. And I think neuroprocessing comes into play here, in that I believe in Western society at least, but maybe more so, I think we live in a world that's dominated by extroverts. And I interestingly think that is a linkage to gender. We tend to think very stereotypically, of course, of men and as loud, aggressive, outgoing, and that sort of thing. And I think we tend to demean introverts. You're too quiet, you're too shy, which are highly judgmental things, and there's nothing wrong with quiet. And in the early 2000s, I did read through two books, Introvert Power and Introvert Advantage, which were great. But I really have to give credit to, and I want to give credit to them, but also I think the book that's now become well known and is very well written is of Susan Cain, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Never Stops Talking. Says me, who's talking a lot, ha. But of course, as one of those other two introvert books says, that people who are introverted, when we're talking about things we're passionate about, we come across as extroverts because we can't shut up.
Exactly, yes. Relatable, yeah.
Yeah. And another useful book, which will have a lead in here, is called A Career Guide for Creative and Unconventional People by an American author, Carol Eichelberry. And why I mention that is one day I was on her blog and this term came up, highly sensitive person. And I thought, what's that? And I went over to the website for that, did the self-test, got 18 out of 24. And it was like, hello.
Ding dong.
The ding dong, tick, tick, tick. Oh, that's why that's important. And I wanted to mention that leading into to things like Tantra and sexuality, because in terms of things like kink, for example, I need to play very, very lightly. So highly sensitive people, are people who take in that sensory information in greater length, depth and breadth than it would seem the median of the population does. So for someone else to be tapped on the wrist like that is like putting the proverbial tree trunk to my backside if we're talking in kink terms. There is that difference in perception, and it made a big difference when I was working through sexuality and Tantra. And how I really got involved in that part of my life was in 2014, one of the most wonderful people I've met, Helena May, who is, at least, I'm not sure if she's still practicing, but is a former sex worker, invited the authors of Urban Tantra, or one of the authors, Dossie Easton, to visit Australia. And Helena invited me to do this workshop, and I was not sure why I was, but she was gently guiding me, and she said, look, please do it. And I said, look, I can't afford it. And she said, look, I'll give you a really discounted ticket, $50 instead of, $500. And when I went in to use the discount code, she'd actually given it to me for free.
Wow.
And I had worked a lot with my mind, but probably not in a holistic way with my body. And when we did this weekend, this 2-day workshop, there were two elements to it. It was very queer. We had people of all bodies in terms of, we'll say, biological sex, however assigned at birth and whatever they were now, and all gender identities and sexualities. And, of course, most of this work is so heteronormative and cisgender normative. And the thing was, when we got to some of the exercises, I hit a bit of a wall, because part of my early life had been that the combination of an all-boys school and not feeling very confident and often being demeaned meant that I'd become very passive. And when it came time, it sounds so easy to just say no to something, I couldn't do it, and I hit a real emotional wall. And also there were other exercises we did where so much emotions had, where you look at some of your shadow emotions, and the one that was really a struggle for me was anger, because it's, for me, that is personally, that's my most intense emotion, and as a highly sensitive person, that's really challenging. But we worked through it, and the good news was that people from that group stayed in touch with each other afterwards. We were mostly from the Melbourne area, so if people needed to catch up with each other, we could easily first do a phone call or a web chat or whatever, and then go out for dinner. And that was a really good thing. And so it helped me realise that I was able to shift energies. And then now we get to sort of where we really get to on Queering Tantra. From that, I went on to do Barbara Carellis's Urban Tantra course in the mid-2010s when she visited Melbourne. And I'm very glad I did that. And I was very fortunate to witness something which was the first erotic massage to someone whose sense of identity is, I'll say, beyond male or female. And I'm not going to disclose the person's body, and this has been, discussed publicly, so obviously I'm not going to identify the person. And so it just shows that Tantra does not have to be this very heteronormative, cis-normative approach. It can be, and it doesn't have to be a couple either, of course. It can be polyamorous and, multiple people involved. So really, really important that, so that's just some of the journeys I've been through. That's still a very potted history of everything. And Tantra's been a big help in helping me shift energies and blocks and keep growing as a person, which goes all the way back to that moment where I said I need to keep doing personal growth, because there's lots of other journeys in life that I've needed to travel or wanted to travel or just have travelled. And,
Mhm.
having that sense of unblocking and calming has not carrying energy around, because becoming passive meant people were dumping their anger on me and I
Mhm.
was carrying it and storing it. And once I got rid of it, it was just a huge change. So, and that there's been lots of adventures in life that have, and situations generally that have needed to make sure that anger had been largely got out of the way. And it has been,
Yeah.
which has been really
That's
good.
that's such a thing, isn't it, for highly
Mm,
sensitive people and empaths? I
yeah.
notice that myself, and I have to be
Mm,
so not careful, but aware. I have to be really aware of it. And yeah, I like what you said about it. Sounds like Tantra is very healing for you.
yeah.
And I wondered from your own gender journey and learning about Tantra, what have you learned specifically about masculinity and femininity? Has it changed your definition of it or how you see it?
Ah, here is something that came up when we did the Barbara Carellis week. And the situation with that is that there's an exercise called the gender walk. And it's about moving from one side of a room to another. And I'm just sort of trying to not to breach anything confidential, but
Of
let's
course,
just
yeah.
say it's related to gender. And so, in answer to your question, it helped me link my particular mix of what society arbitrarily defines in inverted commas as masculine, close inverted commas, open them again, and feminine, and put my own unique mix in there. That I have a very powerful mix. That I if I had to be binary and use these somewhat arbitrary labels, I'm sure I'm far more feminine. But I think I had to take that journey where I, starting with my true strength of what society calls feminine, and then finding a way to bring my masculine in there. And in that sense, they're just their own blend. And doing this walk really empowered me and energized me to really bring all my strengths together more. So a
Mm,
combination of strong compassion and empathy that stands up for myself and other people where needed. And in that sense, Tantra really helped me achieve that and helped me be a lot stronger in my life for some things that came up after around 2015, 2016 when I did the course.
hmm Yeah. So, what would you say is one of the most misunderstood things about Tantra, and especially when it comes to queering Tantra?
Tantra generally, I think that, like so much of Tantra and kink, it's all about this wild, in inverted commas again, wild, heavy, huge amounts of sex. And of course, it may not be. I think it's a very unique and individual experience, and that there's so much more to it than that. And I think
hmm
perhaps part of that misconception comes from our whole societal attitude to anything to do with sex in terms of the words intimacy and intercourse as opposed to male female intersex, that we're just sold so many stupid Hollywood type images of lovers falling in love and having wild steamy scenes, or people's ideas about anything kink or tantra that isn't, in inverted commas, vanilla cis male cis female sex. And
hmm
I think that, of course, every experience is unique in that moment, I think would be my first thing. And the second thing is that Tantra, of course, it can be queer, as is anything. But again, we just live in that expected world of cisgender and heterosexual and monogamous and all the other things. And in terms of gender expression, masculine, male, female, feminine, it's like, oh, give me a break. Anything, any two people can be any two people, of any
hmm
body, gender, identity, gender expression. And, of course, it doesn't have to be two. And on we go. So I think that's the
hmm
really important bit, for me, is that for me to try to define Tantra and queer Tantra, they're not definable, and that's the beautiful thing. But
hmm
let's just let everyone find their own way. Mm.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So, do you have any tips about? I mean, the setting like a sex workshop or Tantra or anything like that is obviously quite a specific scenario.
Mm.
But I feel it's like the more I learn about this, the more I'm seeing the difference or like the separation between man, woman, and masculine, feminine, and how they can experience or be
Mm-hmm.
experienced differently and how different combinations are possible. So, do you have any tips about talking to people who have like a different than typical physical experience? Like, obviously, there are men with a vagina and women with a penis, and it's good to just normalize that. So, looking at your journey in Tantra specifically, what has that taught you about that?
Whew. I think again that perhaps I'll frame it by saying one of my favourite sayings. Sometimes people ask me, okay, so how many genders are there really? And I'll say, oh, at least 7.8 billion, one for
Hmm.
everyone on the planet. And that's at
Yeah.
any given split second in time. And I think, jokes aside, that is the critical thing, that it's just framed my ability to perhaps be more in the present moment, and that, the more we break down the dreaded binaries of body and gender. And of course, we look at nature and see that there's not just, these two distinct boxes, that
Mm.
it means that things are possible, of course, so long as those things are appropriate age, consenting, safe, and there's communication. Those sorts of basics come into it. And then
Hmm.
it's really, then if those foundations are in place, it's over to the imagination, and it doesn't matter the body's gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, romantic label, whatever, of the people involved.
Mm. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't talked about yet?
If we're going to just come back to gender for a second, one of the things
Mm.
I've been musing about a bit lately, and I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of different events that have been happening, or when I say happening, have been received much attention in Australia in the first part of this year. And I will
Mm.
say content warning for sexual assault. But that is the horrendous behaviour that has been, just so the lawyers don't go to, has been alleged about behaviours in our Parliament House, and how much, the dominant behaviour is misuse of power, there's so much misuse of power in terms of masculine hierarchy. And I've been
Mm.
thinking about this in the context of leadership, and
Hmm.
how gendered our leadership ideas are, that whether we realise it or not, they are so still masculine dominated to a large extent. And of course, that's, at least in my experience, ingrained into us so early on. And I think about that for those who are fortunate enough to have had some sort of schooling, if I can use that word, whether it's been going to a place or homeschooling, we're probably taught how to speak and say words and construct sentences. We're taught those sorts of things. And that's probably a very masculine approach. Now, hands up, listeners at home, how many of you were actually taught listening skills? Probably no one in the
Mm-mm.
first 12 years of their school. Sure, some people might have done some classes or training in their life post schooling or tertiary education, such as university, but still it's relatively few. And I mean, we as much as I don't like binaries in simple terms, we've got to spend 50% of our time, give or take, doing some listening. It's a large chunk, yet none of us are taught how to do it.
Mm.
And I think that we can therefore combine our masculine and feminine better if we do make some effort to learn to listen better and take what listening skills we have. And we've all got some degree of skill. There was a horrendous book published in Australia around the turn of the century, one of those gender stereotypical, almost clickbait books, in my opinion, Why Men Can't Listen and Why Women Can't Read Roadmaps.
Mm.
Seriously?
I've
You
heard
know,
of that.
every every one of us on this planet has a mix of skills that are arbitrarily defined as masculine and feminine. And therefore, we all can lead in our own way. It doesn't have to be, of course, men or even masculine people. And I think that maybe that links into Tantra, that if we learn how to receive information and receive sensation, then maybe we can all be better off. And it seems that most of the people who do think about this, the Tantra area, think that we're not really taught how to receive. I mean, how many of us, when we receive a compliment that is quite genuine and well-deserved by whatever measure, will go, oh, it was nothing, or, oh, and then try, or almost go, well, look, I did this and this, rather than just going, oh, thank you. And someone I know who's a musician said to me once, she never knew how to take compliments for the gigs that she did or her recordings. And a friend of hers just said there's so much impure, in psychological terms, impure air out there. When you get a nice, genuine compliment, just breathe it in. Oh, thank you. Well, I think maybe that's something to take on board with Tantra. When we get something nice, learn how to receive it. And, yet we're sort of taught this so much of everything. And, of course, things to do with sex, as are framed, even if it's relatively good consensual sex, are framed so often in masculine and male terms as well. So I think that so much of our leadership in so many areas could be reformed to be more nuanced and balanced. And that, that's not just in, say, the business world or the world of work. People might work in the public sector or the community not-for-profit sector or small business or self-employed. I think that it's in everything. And imagine if we all enriched these foundation type of skills, we'd be better leaders and we'd be better to each other.
For sure. Yeah, especially like what you just said about the whole giving and receiving thing. That's something I've been thinking about recently. I don't know if you've heard of a book called The Art of Receiving and Giving, The Wheel of Consent by Betty.
I've heard of Betty Martin and The Wheel of Consent, yes, but I didn't realise it was that was the full title.
Yeah. I think I don't know if she's used it as part of like just a diagram or workshops or something, but there is a book as well that I found recently and I just started reading it and I was kind of blown away by it because when you break it down, and especially like reflecting back in hindsight and becoming more aware of stuff and the way I've been brought up was very normative, Yeah, and especially being conditioned or socialized as a woman. Yeah, you're meant to be doing a lot more giving than receiving. And like you say, receiving compliments, you have to almost play it down. And also even achievements and things that we feel good about. It's almost like, oh no, you can't take pride in anything. You can't be proud of yourself. You can't be like reveling in accomplishments, but also in just being who you are, not necessarily what you've achieved. Because again, that's kind of a patriarchal toxic thing, really.
Yeah.
Because a lot of our self-worth is linked to what we do and what we achieve and how we perform. And it's like you say, it's all about unlearning all that, which I'm in the process of too. Yeah. So what is next for you? You said you're involved in lots of the local queer community and stuff. What is it you do there?
Right now, I'll go back before I go forward, so to speak. I proudly was one of the founders of the organisation Transgender Victoria, which, as the name suggests, is an organisation focused on transgender people in Victoria. We founded it in 1999 and registered it in 2000, and it's now, by anyone's standards, a large organisation. And I had been on what is called the Committee of Management for most of its existence, but pulled back in 2019. I'm still involved now as a diversity educator focusing on LGBTIQA+, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersex, queer, asexual, aromantic. And I also, in line with my original commerce training way back, I still do the accounting for this organisation, which is detailed, would be my words. But where I want to go next, I have really been thinking, or not just thinking, there's two areas that I want to do. One of the things that emerged through being involved in, I'll use the shorthand, rainbow communities, is that one of the things that works so well in life, but in particular in these communities, is personal stories. And over the years, I've developed that. When we do one of our 3-hour training sessions, and usually we have 2 presenters, we allow ourselves about 5 to 7 minutes each to do bits of our personal story with the focus on gender and or sexuality. But what I've developed over time is what I, with dry humour, call the extended dance mix personal story, which goes for about 45 minutes and then do a Q&A. I don't want to use the words TED Talk. I don't really like the concept, and I also don't like the concept that you have to memorize TED Talks, but that's what it is. But it's also about not just a talk. It's not just a emotional journey. It's what I've learned during that journey. And the other thing that I was thinking about, and of course, so much on our minds, particularly last year, 2020, at the time of last year being 2020, at the time of our conversation was COVID-19 and lockdowns. And here in Melbourne, we unfortunately had a pretty severe lockdown from around July, August, September, our winter, due to an outbreak. And thankfully, we've been on top of it pretty much ever since. Haven't had too many, and we haven't had lockdowns to that extent. But at that time, amongst a number of things, yes, we obviously around the world in particular still have so much of the pandemic, and acknowledging that the UK is only just re-emerging from a recent lockdown from everything we can gather over here. But I'm even sure, let's say we get most of us vaccinated and we keep on top of these variations, we'll have the pandemic somewhat under control, but there's going to be a mental health pandemic for years, decades after this. My friends who work in mental health care, my own mental health professionals just say they are sort of having to constantly turn people away and refer on. And, if you do have specialised issues, it can sometimes be hard to find an inclusive practitioner, but that's another issue. But I began to think, would I study as a mental health professional? And the answer was no. I worked with I'll use the term a marketing coach last year. So someone who specialises in coaching people, but in how they market themselves and what they do. And she reminded me that I studied some years ago as a life coach. And I think that would be a better approach for me rather than being a strict mental health professional. I think that would be too draining and too intense for me as an HSP. Whereas I think a life coach would be something that could be really great. The other part of it is linking into the personal story. I could then sort of do that personal story and say, well, you can break out of things, you can learn and unlearn things. Come and work with me as a life coach. So that's sort of where I want to go next. But also, I really am thinking a lot about this issue of leadership, and particularly in rainbow communities. I think we have issues there. It's a huge topic in itself that sometimes we don't get good leadership. I've seen a lot of that in my 20 years of involvement in the local communities, both trans and all of LGBTIQ. And I think I've got something, and it's just, I do feel very passionate about it. And so I'd like to do more of those sorts of things, life coaching, personal story, leadership, with obviously a perspective in relation to gender.
Yeah, awesome. So where can people find you?
You can find me at sallygoldner.com and get in touch with me. The other thing that did come out of that thing last year is, of course, even 55-year-olds like me who remember when telegrams were bits of paper that said, congratulations on your big day, stop, wishing you all the best, stop, and it's not an app at all. Well, we all learned how to use technology a little more, and I think that, that has been, if there is such a thing as a plus out of last year, it has been an advantage. And, of course, we are connecting, if we could do it before, we're connecting on the proverbial other sides of the world. I think that will be so important going forward, that we combine what we learnt. And obviously, yes, you've still got, I think, as humans, we do need some sort of personal contact in terms of energy and body language and those sorts of things. But we will find a way, dare I say, to take a non-binary approach and blend both. And so for someone like me, we can, put both together. And from the life coaching point of view, provided, as we've done to record this, we work out the time zones well enough, of course, anyone could work together anywhere in the world. And who knows, as we can travel more, I prefer in person. I found that the diversity training I did last year it was manageable online, but it wasn't the same. And a lot of people who do similar work said so. But hopefully, eventually, I'll be able to go around the world and do what I'd like to do. But I'll find ways to do it online. It's not impossible. And so that's sort of where I'm heading, those 3 areas: life coaching, leadership, and personal story.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah, I do think I hope they're going to keep doing some things because obviously we've had to adapt because of the COVID situation. But I like that there are certain things that we have started doing online. I think it's expanded our horizons because we've had to. And I think it's nice to just have the option to do things, this way or that way. And I
Yeah,
hope they keep a bit of both in. So that's good. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
An absolute pleasure, Esther. Thank you for the invite. And, well,
Yeah,
keep podcasting away,
thank you.
because I just think that sharing information, it sounds so obvious, but it is such a powerful thing. And the more we can
Stories,
do it
right?
all, is
Mm,
stories, the better.
yeah.
Yep.
You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Sally, where you can also read the transcript. And you can find Sally on her website, sallygoldner.com. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com and on social media. If you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Plans start from only $1 a month. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender for more details. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded. In your email, you said you're a fellow introvert and highly sensitive person, so I can relate to that a lot.
May I ask, are you both yourself, or?
I am both, yes, for
Oh,
sure.
wow, what a small
Yeah,
world. There you go.
yeah.
If the centre of our intersection is trans, that's good. But if we find all the, roads leading into the intersection, whether it's dominant, kinky, HSP, bi, Jewish,
Mm,
whatever,
yeah.
it's good too, because of course it's the visibility factor, which we need bits of
Mm,
bits of everybody, which is so important.
totally.
Yeah.